Okay, do you want me to continue to let him in?
Yes, please, would you? I'm going to try to record. I don't know that mine will work. But... Thank you, Mike. So good morning. Thank you guys for joining us today for our National Phenology Network workshop. I know there's kind of a lot of stuff going on today, so we're really glad that you guys are here. Got a great group, looks like. My name's Lori Young. I'm the Plant Conservation, Wildlife, Weeds Training Coordinator at the BLM National Training Center in Phoenix. And again, we're really pleased that you guys joined us today. We are recording this session if you didn't get that memo already, and you'll be able to go back and review some of this later if you think you missed anything. I know we've had probably more experience with Zoom over the past year than we ever thought we would, but not to take anything for granted. You guys, we want to keep you muted because there are so many people on. You can unmute yourself by either going by your name on the participant list and unclicking your microphone, or down in the lower left corner of your screen is another microphone. You can mute yourself that way. You don't need to turn your camera on if you don't want to. It'll probably save you some bandwidth. And we'll have Q&A sessions throughout, so you'll be able to ask questions if you want, and you can unmute your microphone, or you can put them in the chat. Make sure that you chat to everyone so that, because other people may have the same question, and we'll have some time to, Aaron will go over some questions and answers later in our program. So we'll keep track of those, write them in the chat. So now I want to introduce our speaker for the day. Her name is Erin Posthumus, and Erin leads USA-NPN's outreach and engagement efforts with Nature's Notebook observers and USA-NPN partners. She is also the USA-NPN liaison to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is working with the National Wildlife Refuges across the country to implement phenology monitoring to meet their resource management goals. So with that, we'll turn it over to Erin.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. It's so great to have such a great turnout on this very busy day, as Lori mentioned. There are lots of things going on, and we do appreciate you taking the time to spend a couple hours with us on Zoom. I know there's been a lot of Zooms and online meetings. So we're excited to share with you all the information about what we have available for BLM. We have Teresa Crimmins on the call as well. She's the director for the USA National Phenology Network, and she's been with the network since the beginning in 2007. I've been with the network about 10 years as well, so you're in good hands to learn all about all the different resources that we have available for you. I also want to say thank you so much for Lori for putting this together for us, and also to Bruce Rittenhouse, who retired last month. He was on a webinar with us last year and thought that this would be a great thing to share with BLM. So he was really a big force in getting this to happen. So thank you to both of you. And thanks to Michael as well for being on here as support. So I am going to share my screen. All right, so let me go to the next slide so everyone can see that. Okay, so just to go over what we're planning to cover today, we are scheduled for 3 hours here. Really, the first 2 hours is going to be an overview of really what phenology is, some of the applications of phenology for BLM in particular. And then we're going to go over an overview of all of the data and data products that we have available at the NPN for you to use. I'll do a brief overview in that part of Nature's Notebook, our data collection program. But then if you really want to stick on for the 3rd hour and really get to know Nature's Notebook and how you can implement it at your location, then you can stick on with us for that final hour from 12 to 1 p.m. And learn all about Nature's Notebook at that point. All right, I think I'm also going to stop my video just for bandwidth reasons as we get started. All right. So just to kick us off, I'd love to know where you're all calling in from. So if you want to put in the chat where you're calling in from, whether it's the BLM unit or land that you represent or just your location, it would be great to get an idea of all the different places that people represent here. Teresa and I are both in Tucson, Arizona, and we're really excited that we have rain in the forecast tonight. We've been really dry here in the last year, and we have a good storm coming in, so we're really excited about that happening later today. So it looks like we've got people from all across the country, which is great. Lots of places in the West. Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Montana. Awesome. Thank you for chatting that in. So we're going to have a couple opportunities as we go through the workshop today for you to ask questions. Feel free to just post any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll have a couple points where we get to those. We'll also have some opportunities for you to give us feedback on some of the products that we have and other things that you might want. And so we'll have lots of opportunities for those in the next couple hours. So first off, I always like to start with just making sure everyone's on the same page about what phenology is. So the way we define phenology is it's the timing of life cycle events of plants and animals. And phenology has, oops, my slide is advancing. Phenology has just a ton of different applications, from knowing about potential mismatches between plants and pollinators, to knowing about wildfire risk, being able to more effectively treat invasive species, knowing about agricultural timing, allergy season, insect pests. So there's just a ton of different applications that we can talk about. Phenology is also a great indicator of climate change. Because phenology is often driven by things like temperature and precipitation, it's a really great reflection of the changes that are happening in climate. And it's something that's really easy to see because we can look at the plants and animals around us and see how they're changing over time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that phenology is perhaps the simplest process in which to track changes in the ecology of species in response to climate change. I also like to share this quote from Aldo Leopold, who actually tracked phenology at the Shack in Wisconsin. And the work that he did in documenting different plant and animal life cycle events there has been carried on by his daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley, as well. So it's a really great record of phenology in Wisconsin over a long time period. So I always like to include that. I feel like it's a great representation of just talking about phenology as this great horizontal science that really crosses so many different professions and is very relevant for natural resource management. So getting into some of the applications of phenology that I think are relevant for BLM, it can be used to improve invasive species management. So phenology can inform the amount of time that you have in between different life cycle events that might be relevant for knowing when to get out and either remove or treat with herbicide a particular invasive. So for example, in Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge in the Pacific, they have a large problem with Verbicina insuloides, golden crownbeard, and that plant had taken over the islands there and really just created this dense cover that prevented the seabirds there, including the albatross, from being able to nest. So they had a long program where they tried to get rid of that invasive species, and they're really having trouble once they got down to these kind of distributed patches of plants that were kind of hard to get to. So by tracking phenology, they were able to identify how much time they had in between the leaf emergence of the plant and then when it would drop its seeds, which was when they really wanted to prevent that from happening. So they were able to identify the amount of time they had in different seasons and be able to more effectively schedule their management activities there. Another example of invasive species, phenology can inform the timing of when to apply herbicides to make that most efficient. So another example from the Southwest here, buffalo grass is an invasive species that is a really big problem here in the Sonoran Desert. The plants are very highly flammable and create these dense stands of grasses where it really fills in the natural gaps we have in vegetation. And it's highly flammable, so it creates this new fire in the system that's not really fire adapted at all. So it's a great risk to our native plants and animals, and really outcompetes the native plants that we have here. So the plants can only really be sprayed with herbicide when they're at least 50% green. So by knowing about the phenology and when the plants are green, it allows the natural resource managers to get out at the right time to be able to treat those plants more effectively. So there was a researcher who identified the precipitation threshold that will trigger that green up that happens. Another application of phenology is informing the timing of fire. So wildfire risk has been linked to vegetation greenness, and that can be actually even measured from satellites. And then it can also help to know the best time for prescribed fire so that it is targeted at the right time for the ideal fuel moisture level so you don't have fires that burn too hot. One example of this, a study that came out last year, was on camise, which is a widespread chaparral plant in California. And the researchers used phenology information to identify the level of fuel moisture was lined up with the timing in between flowering and fruiting of those plants. So it allowed them to have this way to just look at the landscape and see the status of when the plants were flowering before they fruited, and know that that was a time that would be the most risk of plant flammability, when the fuel moisture was at the lowest. So it provides a really rapid assessment that can be done without a lot of tools to measure the fuel moisture in the plants by just looking out and seeing the status of the flowering. Another example of the way we can apply phenology is with insect pests. So a lot of insects have an emergence threshold that's based on temperature. So we can look at the amount of heat that's accumulated in a particular location and predict when an insect will emerge. So for example, we know that bronze birch borer adults will emerge after 450 growing degree days. And so at that time is when it's best to spray them with, or spray the trees with pesticide, because once the adults lay their eggs and then the eggs hatch, the larvae are under the bark of the trees, and it's really hard to be able to access and treat them at that point. So knowing when the adults are emerging and susceptible to the pesticide is very helpful for timing that treatment. Another application is knowing about the timing of food resources for wildlife of interest. So there are quite a few T&E species like monarchs and different nectar feeding bats that rely on nectar being available at particular points along their migration pathway. So knowing when that nectar is available can help understand whether that nectar source is becoming mismatched with when the animals need it. So for example, the timing of flowering of different agaves and saguaro cacti is important for knowing when nectar is available for bats like the lesser long-nosed bat that migrate up from Mexico. And so by tracking phenology, we can understand whether the flowering is available at the right time. Another application is knowing about when particular sensitive life cycle events are happening in animals so that you can avoid doing restoration or construction activities during those times. So for example, the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in South Albuquerque has been transitioning from a dairy, it used to be a dairy and then a alfalfa farm, into native wetlands and bosque forest. And so they're dealing with needing to do demolition on different old buildings, like an old milk barn. But the problem is the milk barn was used by different birds for nesting, like cliff swallows and barn swallows. So they're able to use phenology information and records of when the birds nested to know when to avoid doing those activities. And then timing of seed harvest as well, knowing when the best time is to get out to harvest native seeds. So for example, there's a group here, Borderlands Restoration in Arizona, and they are interested in collecting agave seeds so that they can propagate plants and then plant those agaves out onto the landscape for bats like the lesser long-nosed bat. And so they're interested in knowing when the fruiting is happening so that they can get out and collect those seeds at the right time. So here is our first Menti poll. So we're going to have a couple of these for you to provide some feedback to us. So we'd love to know how phenology information would help you in your work. So thinking about some of these examples that I've shared, maybe they've triggered some ideas for other things. What would help you the most? What are some of the species that phenology information would be useful to you? So if you go to, you can use your phone or your computer, menti.com, and then plug in this code here. And then maybe Teresa or Lori can plug that into the chat as well. So we have it, and then I'm gonna switch over to look at the results here as people start to chat them in. All right, so we're starting to get some results. And this is going to be a word cloud. So the more people say the same thing, the word will be larger for those species. And you should be able to put in a couple different responses, I think up to 3, if you have multiple ideas. All right, now we're getting some more. Okay, peony cacti, milkweed. We're getting some invasive species. Russian thistle is really coming up as a big problem. Some of these are totally new to me, so I'm going to have to look up what the scientific names are. Now we're getting a lot. Cheatgrass, really emerging. And we've got some things coming in the chat as well. I don't know if Teresa, do you want to say anything about cheatgrass and our plans for that? I don't think I have that in any of my slides.
Sure. Yeah. So we've heard from folks within the agency as well as some other partner organizations that understanding when cheatgrass is flowering and then developing seed heads is actually pretty important for grazing, and that it's a reasonable source of forage up until it starts to flower. And so having a forecast of when that event is likely to occur is helpful, especially for planning grazing rotations. And so we are actively working with researchers in the U.S. Geological Survey out of Fort Collins to develop predictive models for when cheatgrass will flower or fruit, so that we can operationalize that hopefully next spring. That's the plan, is to have that up and functional by next year. And same thing for red brome.
Cool, thank you. This is great. So this will, you can keep putting in responses. I'm gonna go back over to my presentation, but feel free to keep typing them in. Okay, so to give you an overview of the NPN and what we do, we've been around since about 2007. So the NPN was established with this, people recognizing that there was a need for phenology information, standardized phenology data collection across the country to meet that need for understanding climate change and the impacts on the environment. So the NPN was established. We're based at the University of Arizona. Kind of just by chance, one of our co-founders was a USGS employee who was based at the U of A. So that's kind of how we ended up there. But our main objectives are to collect, store, and share phenology data and information. And we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary a couple years ago. So our main, what we call our pillars of what we do are to inform decisions, advance science, communicate and connect, and create an equitable and inclusive network. And so under informing decisions, we work with a lot of agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, the BLM and the Forest Service, and a lot of other natural resource managers to make sure that they have the phenology information they need for management. So I'll talk more later about the ways that we're working with the Fish and Wildlife in particular, but we're really trying to just talk with these natural resource managers, find out what it is they need, and then either help them collect the data themselves or give them data products or data or phenology information that will help them to make management decisions. We also work to advance science. So by collecting phenology information through Nature's Notebook, we make available this huge data source that researchers can use to answer questions. And we also have an active community of researchers that we're connected with. So we're consistently sharing resources about what new data products we have available, the different tools that we have for data visualization and download to allow people to continue to advance the field of phenology. We also have different ways that we communicate and connect with a variety of audiences, including the public, about phenology. So we try to make available digestible resources that tell people what's being learned in the field of phenology. We create summaries of peer-reviewed research to share with the public. We have a variety of newsletters that we send out. And we just try to make sure that people are aware of phenology and that it's accessible to the public. We're also actively involved in helping the media with understanding phenology. So especially at this time of year, in the springtime, we have a lot of reporters that come to us and ask about different aspects of spring and kind of what's changing, what's happening with phenology. So we do a lot of work there in communicating about phenology. And then we also recently established a pillar where we're trying to create an equitable and inclusive network. So we're interested in making sure that phenology information is accessible to everyone and that we're including all audiences in this work that we're doing. So we are reaching out to groups like the Indigenous Phenology Network and other groups and just trying to make sure that everyone is involved in the work that we're doing. So the primary way that we get phenology data into our national phenology database is with our program called Nature's Notebook. So this is a plant and animal phenology data collection program that has been ongoing since about 2008. And we have over 19,000 active observers that have collected data for the program since we started at over 15,000 sites. We're up to over 23 million records of phenology in the National Phenology Database. And all of those records are freely available for download and visualization on our website. These data have been used in over 90 publications to date. And we have a number of different data products that I'll be talking about too. The map here on the left shows the density of records that have come in across the country. So you can see that we do have a number of gaps in more rural areas. A lot of our observers are located in more urban centers. So you can see that a lot of our densest locations are places where there's a city. So we are very interested in trying to fill in these gaps. And I think that's where BLM can really be helpful as well, as you're often located in more rural areas. So if you are able to collect data, that will really help to fill in these gaps in phenology data to help us have a better understanding of changes that are happening across the country. So I mentioned that all of the data are freely available for exploration and download. We have a visualization tool that allows you to explore all of the data that are available. There's two different kind of parts to this tool. There are curated seasonal stories, and these are something that we update every season. They are kind of little stories that we can learn about and kind of give an overview of how to use the tool as well. They're meant as tutorials. So if you go to that URL there, you'll see the seasonal stories right there on the homepage. And so you can get to know how to use the different types of visualizations. There are 3 of them represented here. We have a scatter plot, which allows you to compare the onset of different life cycle events compared to different abiotic variables like latitude or elevation, or different climatic variables like the seasonal minimum or maximum temperature values. And then we have an activity curve, which allows you to actually compare the overlap in different life cycle events of plants and animals, or different plants. So here's the saguaro and white-winged dove, which is a pollinator of saguaro flowers, and you can see where the overlap is between those 2 life cycle events last year. You can also create a calendar, which is the one on the bottom there, and that's showing you basically the presence or absence of different life cycle events that were reported on dates across the year. So this one is looking at 2 shrubs. One is an invasive shrub, multiflora rose. The other is a native shrub, northern spice bush, and looking at the difference in timing of when those plants leaf out last year. So often invasive species have an advantage and they leaf out earlier. So this is showing that pretty clearly. So we have any of the species that are on our Nature's Notebook list, you can explore in the Viz tool. So you can look up different species information or different information for your location and see the data that we have available. We also have a way to just download basically an Excel file or a CVS file of the data, and that is on our Phenology observation portal. So you can try out different formats of data. So we have our status and intensity data is basically our raw format of the data. So that's going to give you all of the information that we have that are exactly as it's collected on the data sheet, basically. And then we have a number of different summarized formats of the data as well. So we have it summarized at the individual level. So for a plant, that would be actually showing you the onset of when the life cycle event happened, and then the duration, instead of just each observation date, whether someone said a yes or a no. And then the site phenometrics is summarizing if someone was monitoring multiple individual plants at a particular site, it'll actually give you the average of all of those. And then the magnitude phenometrics is related to that, the second visualization that I showed on the previous slide. So looking at the kind of the intensity of when the life cycle events were happening over the course of the year. So like what was the proportion of people that said that, yes, a life cycle event was happening on a particular week of the year. So you can also filter for particular species or locations, date ranges, and or data that are collected by particular groups of observers across the country. And then you can also download different variables in combination with your phenology data. So a lot of climatic data. So if you wanted to download like the seasonal minimum and maximum temperatures, it'll give you a file that has the climate data that's correlated to that location that you downloaded the phenology data for. So in addition to our, what we call our observed phenology data, we also create different data products. So we work with stakeholders to develop products that are something they need. So our process is we will identify a client who needs phenology data. We will either find, maybe we have the data already in the National Phenology Database, or we will help them collect the data, or we will launch a campaign to have our observers collect the data for them. We can then create a model with the data and then develop a product which is in the format that they need. And then we can use more phenology data to validate that model and that product to improve it. And then we can work with the client to communicate that product in a way that is the most useful for their users to actually take advantage of it. So to go into a little bit more depth, we often meet with our stakeholders, find out what exactly it is that they need, develop a prototype. We have a lot of back and forth with our stakeholders to make sure that it's something that is going to meet their needs. Once we get feedback, often we will revise what the map or the forecast or the product looks like. And then once we release it, we can go back through and do more either validation or improvements to it over time. So here's an example of one of the products that we make available. This is our spring leaf index. So this is one of 2 different maps that we make available that show an indicator of early season plant activity. And Teresa just posted in the chat where we host these maps on our website on our status of spring page. And this map is a completed map from last year. So basically what you're looking at is a series of different pixels that are 2.5 kilometers wide. And for each of those locations, this map is showing you the date on which our first leaf index requirements were met. So you can see that in the southern part of the country, we have those locations met the requirements for spring early in the year, in January, going up to the highest elevations in the Mountain West, where those locations met the requirements of spring later, more in the summer. So this information is based on a model of phenology data that is a long-term data set of early season plants, including lilacs and honeysuckles. This was a project that was launched back in the 1950s. Lilacs were recognized as a plant that is an early season plant, so it's an indicator of some of the first plants that leaf out or bloom in the springtime. It's also a plant that was very widespread at the time, that could be planted in a lot of places across the country. So cloned versions of that plant were distributed, and people started observing them. And we have this long-term data set of over 60 years that we can look at and see when these plants leafed and flowered over time. And so the great advantage of that is researchers were able to look at all of that data and develop a model that would use all of those different dates of leaf out and blooming and look at how they, what was the relationship of those events to the weather at the time, and then identify a model that shows, based on your weather that in a particular year, when do you expect to see leafing and flowering for those plants. So I think and this is the bloom map as well. So this is the bloom time of those early season plants, which happens after the leafing, obviously, in this species. So this is showing when early season plants typically bloom in the spring. And this has been found to be correlated to a lot of the deciduous overstory trees when those leaf out, which generally is later than when smaller shrubs or early season plants will leaf out in the springtime. So I think the great advantage of these maps is not just the raw map of the leaf out and bloom time, but actually the anomaly map that we create as well. So the anomaly map is showing you a comparison of how this year, or any particular year, compares to a long-term average. So it really gives you an idea of how early or late is spring leaf out or bloom this year compared to, it's the period of 1981 to 2010. And we're getting ready to update that period of comparison. That's what's used in climatology as kind of the long-term average that you're measuring up against. But now that we're into 2021, we have another decade of data that we can look at. So we'll be shifting to 1991 to 2020 for that period of comparison and offering those maps as well later this year. So we can use these anomaly maps for a lot of different things to know about how early or how late is spring. So knowing about early spring can be helpful in knowing about the appearance of turfgrass pests or the risk of damage to fruit trees, knowing if it's an early spring and there might have been early or hot weather that triggered leaf out in plants like fruit trees, and then that's followed by a late frost that can be a great risk, damaging those blossoms or the early fruit. And then we also can look at how that impacts allergy season. So an early springtime will lead to an earlier and potentially longer or more severe allergy season. It also makes it difficult to predict different festival timing, so things that are based on when plant activity is happening, like the National Cherry Blossom Festival. The Masters Golf Tournament is usually timed so that there are azaleas in bloom, but if you have an early spring, then those things shift, and it might be very difficult to predict when you can have those events and whether they'll be at the right time. So this map on the top here is showing the leaf index from the end of last year. And then the one on the bottom is showing, as of this morning, how many locations have reached the requirements for spring leaf out. So you can see, because we're early in the year, only so much heat has accumulated so far. So we only have a few different states that have started to meet those requirements. So it's really just Southern Florida, which you can't really see because it's pretty much no difference this year so far. So it's in white. And then California and Arizona and a little bit of Nevada as well have started to meet the requirements. And you might have heard, especially if you live in California, it's been very hot and dry there. So they have already met the requirements. And in some locations, it's actually been weeks ahead of what it usually is compared to that long-term average. And some locations are up to 40 to 50 days ahead of schedule. So we've also created another way of looking at this information that allows you to know how unusual is a spring that we've had like this one. So this one is a map from last year. So this is showing you in a 40-year record, how often do we see a spring like we did in 2020? So the areas that are green are showing places that had an early spring. So for those locations, you can see that in some places it was an early spring, but they often have an early spring, so it wasn't that unusual. But the darkest green locations are places where it was early and it was actually the earliest on record, or they only have a spring maybe once every 39 years or once every 11 to 20 years. And then the purple locations are showing the opposite of where places that where spring arrived late, how unusual was it to have a spring that late? So you can see some of those locations around the Great Lakes saw a really late spring that was the latest spring that they had on record. So a really big difference here in between those northern locations and then a lot of the southeast. So I'm curious to hear your feedback on the map. If you can think back to what you remember about spring last year. Does this map, does it seem like it's in line with what you remember? I'm curious if anyone's from some of those places, like in the West, especially where it was maybe the latest spring on record, or a couple places where it was very early, like in Texas or up in Washington and Oregon. If any of you are from those locations, or really anywhere, if this map seems like it kind of lines up with what you remember, or if you're surprised at the results for your location last year. So you can just post that in the chat. It looks like maybe we'll check in on the questions. It looks like there might be a couple questions there. So it looks like we have someone who was involved in the lilac study in the mid-1980s. That's really cool. Have you explored using adventure scientists? Yes, we have talked with adventure scientists. Yeah, they do a great job of getting out to really remote locations. So that is a really good thought. Is there any move or ability for this to expand to adjacent countries? Yeah, so we have been in some conversations about with people from Mexico. There are some people at UNAM that are interested in starting up a phenology network down there. So there are people that are interested. I think it is difficult to get something like this going. So, and then we've had a number of conversations with some other countries in Europe that have started up phenology networks. And I think Canada has Plant Watch, which is a similar way to collect phenology data there on just plants. Okay, so someone posted, I remember Boise, Idaho having a late spring with lots of rain late. Yeah, it is kind of hard to see on there, isn't it? And I think it's somewhere in this part here of the map, which has a lot of different variation here. So we have some green areas and some purple areas. So it could be that it lines up with one of those darker purple areas. Another thing to keep in mind with this map, because it is a threshold map, you won't see anything for your location until your location reaches the requirements for spring. So you won't really have any information about the onset of spring up until 6 days before, which is when we forecast when your location will reach that. And then once you've passed the threshold, if you've passed the leaf threshold, then you can still look forward to the bloom threshold to kind of get an idea of what's coming. But then once the bloom threshold has been met, you really don't have any more information after that point. So for places that are in the southern part of the country, if you've reached both requirements by March, these maps won't tell you too much more about events after that. But we have another map that I'll show you next, which actually is something you can use throughout the year to look at how temperature accumulations have changed. And then another question, have you coordinated with the Gloria project? We haven't. I have heard of it. Someone mentioned it to me on a webinar last year, but we haven't really worked with them, I don't think. Maybe Teresa has some other idea about that group. But
my understanding is that that's an organization that tracks stuff on mountains, and I think it's biotic and abiotic phenomena. And no, we haven't really made significant inroads either, so I'll make note of that.
Thank you. All right. So I wanted to talk about a couple of ways that we can apply this information, especially in the context of some of these other DOI agencies. So back in 2016, a group of collaborators got together to try to put information about the spring indices in the context of the national parks. So they wanted to look at how over the last 100 years has spring onset changed across the national park system. So they did an analysis to look at how the timing of recent springs, so springs in the last 3 decades compared to the last 100 years. And so the map here shows locations of parks that were either really early, so the most recent decades were very early in the context of those 100 years, or whether they were about on time or average, or whether they were late. So you can see the locations in red are where those recent decades saw a very early spring onset compared to the last 100 years. So they're seeing a shift to very early springs. And then similarly, we did the same analysis for the National Wildlife Refuge System on the right here. And you can see kind of similar patterns where there's a big chunk of the Southeast where it's pretty much the same in those recent decades. And then other parts of, especially the Northeast and the Midwest, the Northern Great Plains, and a lot of places in the West and Alaska, we're seeing shifts to much earlier springs in recent decades. For the National Wildlife Refuge System, we took it another step further and also put this in the context of migratory flyways. So this is an example for Canaan Valley National Wildlife Refuge in the Northeast. And so you can see here that we have the average value of spring leaf onset for those recent decades, which are 1983 to our analysis ended in 2012. And that's March 26th. And then the next line shows the recent change in the spring timing relative to that long 100 years of 1901 to 2012. And that spring first leaf arrival in the recent decades is in that extremely early bin compared to the historical range of 100 years. And this refuge is in the Atlantic Flyway. And we found in our analysis that there's a significant trend toward an earlier onset of spring leaf out and bloom, where the spring was advancing a lot faster up at northern latitudes than at southern latitudes. And a lot of that was due to that kind of the warming hole here in the Southeast, where these refuges were not seeing a very rapid shift, whereas the northern latitudes were seeing this great shift. And so if you think about it from the migratory birds perspective, they're arriving first at locations where things haven't changed much. And then by the time they get up to northern latitudes, those areas are seeing a great shift. And so they're potentially lagging behind when the spring onset is happening at those northern breeding grounds. We also have a tool that allows refuges to see the current status of spring. So this was last year for that same Canadian Valley National Wildlife Refuge. And they were seeing a pretty early spring last year. So it was a range in the different pixels that we have of 2.5 kilometers from 5 days early up to 13 days early, with an average of 10 days early for that refuge. And so this refuge is able to go onto this tool and they can see a 6-day forecast to see when spring arrival is going to happen, and then look at this anomaly map that shows how this year stacks up, how it compares whether spring is early or late compared to that long-term average. And this refuge is actually one of our partner refuges that collects phenology data with Nature's Notebook as well. So they have an additional link here that they can go to a dashboard that shows them their phenology data to kind of see, well, what does this mean for this early spring at their refuge? Another example of how this information has been applied is a paper that came out a couple years ago. A bunch of researchers looked at how migrating birds are keeping up with the shift to earlier springs or not keeping up. And they found that there are a number of species that are lagging behind, where their arrival time is not keeping pace with this shift in earlier springs. And those species were identified here. It's a number of migrants that are in the eastern United States that are just not able to keep up with that shifting timing. Okay, so I'm going to pop over to another Menti poll. So I'd love you to share with us, given what you've learned about the status of spring, how do you think you could use this information? Would knowing about whether spring was going to be maybe like 1 or 2 weeks early at your BLM unit than it was over a long-term average, would that help you to make any sort of decisions? How do you think you could apply this information? So it's the same code as before. I'm going to switch the slide so it'll go to the next one. And this one I think is an open response, so you should be able to chat in your response and we'll see them show up here. And I will look at the questions here too while we're waiting. Did you say how far back the data go? So the majority of the data, I would say, are probably starting in about 2010 is when we started to get a lot of observations coming in. There are some data sets, like the lilac data set is very long. It goes back to the 1950s. We've imported a couple other data sets from partners where it's a little bit longer, but I'd say the majority is it's about 10 years. Okay, it looks like some people are chatting in some answers. When to allow dirt work for pad construction or reclamation to minimize or avoid erosion? Okay, that's interesting. And then timing for herbicide applications. Onset of fire season. Range readiness. Okay. Maybe can you say anything more about range readiness? Maybe a little bit more detail. To compare to shorebird arrival phenology. Another question, I might have missed it, but did you say NPS sites contributed data? Yes, we do have a number of national parks that are using Nature's Notebook to collect phenology data. Timing of data collection, timing rare plant surveys. We usually visit allotments to determine if the range is ready for cattle use. Okay, yeah, cool. Based on soil and veg conditions. I wonder if, oh, do I have to, oh, I see. I have to click this to show. My son's allergies, that's a good one. Field sampling plans. Using native seed collection and invasive weed treatment. That's really great. So yeah, I think another thing we've often wondered is right now, you know, because of the limitation in weather forecasting, which is behind the maps, we're really limited to a period of about a week for forecasting the spring arrival. So I wonder if anyone can speak to that, whether a week timing is enough. You know, if you were to find out that spring arrival will be a week from now, and it will be a week later than normal. Is that information, is that far enough ahead that that would give you information that would be helpful in your planning? Or are you really planning things on a month scale where, you know, you'd really have to have a couple months heads up to know if spring was going to be early or late? If anyone wants to post in the chat feedback on that, that would be really helpful as well. And of course, you know, the farther you get in forecasting, the less accurate it is. So there are some forecasts like through NOAA where they can say, we predict that the temperature is going to be above average or below average. It's a little more coarse of a prediction at that point on that sort of a scale. So some people are saying it isn't enough time from what I've seen. A month would be better than nothing, but more time would be useful. That's about what we thought, but it's good to know. A week could still help in hitch planning for monitoring crews. Okay. Well, that's great feedback. Thank you. All right, let me go back over here. Okay, so the next product that I wanted to talk about is our maps of accumulated growing degree days. So I mentioned this earlier on in talking about some of the potential applications. If you're not familiar with accumulated growing degree days, basically you take a base temperature and a start date. So this map is showing 32-degree base temperature and then a January 1st start date. And for each day that you go above 32 degrees, you add those degrees up across all the days where it's above 32, and you get a value of accumulated growing degree days. And so these maps can be valuable because unlike the status of spring maps, they're not threshold maps. They're showing you a value for each pixel, which is the same size as the status of spring maps at 2.5 kilometers. For each day of the year, it'll give you a piece of information about how much heat has accumulated. And so like with the status of spring maps, we have an anomaly map that we've created that will show you for each location, how does this year compare to a long-term average? And that's that same 1981 to 2010 currently. And so because this is not tied to that threshold of you know, a spring leaf out or bloom in those lilacs and honeysuckles or early season plants, you can use this map anytime in the year. So before the threshold is met, you can look at the map and see how much heat has accumulated and how it's different from the long-term average. You could use it after the threshold of spring is passed later in the year to see what the heat accumulation is like. And so you can compare this year to previous years to that long-term average and use it in planning for different applications. So I wanted you to get a little bit of experience in our Viz tool. So I wanted you to think first about what the weather has been like this year where you live in January so far. and think about how it compares to last year. So does it feel like it's been warmer than normal or cooler than normal or about the same? And you can think about it as how it compares to a long-term average as well, but just kind of get that into your mind about what it feels like. And then let's go to data.usa-npn.org/Viz Tool. And you'll see at the top of the screen there, one of our seasonal stories is a tool where you can plug in your zip code and see how the accumulated growing degrees compared this year to previous years. So let's try that. And I will also bring it up on my screen. Okay, so here, and you can do this on your screen for your own location. I'm going to plug in my zip code here. And I was thinking recently that this year feels pretty warm. I think because it's been so dry, I have it in my mind that this has been kind of a hot, dry winter. And the temperatures have been probably, I would say, warmer than usual. So each of the seasonal stories has some information here that pops up. And this is kind of that tutorial aspect where it tells you what you're looking at, what does this tell you, and then how you can modify it. So you can see that for each one of those 6 seasonal stories that we have on that page. So I'm just waiting for this to load. And then once you close that, that little help box, you can get it back by going to the visualization description here. So still loading. We'll give it a second. It looks like people are chatting in about how it's been so far. More warm days, less precip, much warmer and drier. Cold and dry in Idaho. Not much of a winter in central Wyoming. First day of winter in southern New Mexico. Cold and dry in western Nevada. Okay, so now we're looking at a graph of accumulated growing degree days for Tucson. And so what we're looking at here is the black line represents that 30-year average. So that's the average amount of growing degree days from 1981 to 2010. The yellow line is showing me last year, so 2020. And then the blue line is showing me this year. So I looked at this the other day and I was pretty surprised because, as I said, I was thinking that this year was warmer than normal. I think because it's been so dry, it just feels like it's not much of our typical winter. But it actually is behind what we would normally have. So the amount of accumulated growing degrees, it only actually started a couple of days in, but we're a few days behind that long-term average and even behind last year. So 2020 was behind that long-term average, and then the blue line for 2021 is also behind. And then when the red line starts here, that's actually that forecast. So that's showing as of the 26th next week, what are we going to be seeing there based on the weather forecast. So I'd be curious to know if any of you have had a chance to go into the Viz tool right now and look. Is anything surprising to you? Is about what you thought? You can share that in the chat as well. And then if you want to share in the chat also, if you feel like this information would be helpful to you in any way. I think often our memories aren't always super accurate. So having this kind of data to look at can be really useful in seeing, what I remembered was this seems warm this year, but it actually was much cooler. So it's interesting to know that. We'll give it just a little bit more time in case anyone wants to chat in about what they saw. I know it can take a little bit for the graph to load, so it might be that people are waiting on the visualization to load. But you can also feel free to keep exploring this later. Okay, looks like someone said the chart for Southeast Utah has a stepped line. Does that mean it was like it accumulated in chunks where maybe you had a cold spell? Yeah, in some of your locations, you might be in places where it's too early in the year to have accumulated any growing degree days, so you might not see anything yet, and you might have to check back again maybe next month when you start getting above 32. Yeah, one person said the tool says it's about plus 22 days. You would agree with that? From Mike. Where are you located, Mike? In Reno. Okay. Yeah, I think
Wait,
that was.
which Mike are you talking to?
Oh, Mike Rahi.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Looks like Reno. That sounds about right because I think if you look at our status of spring map, I think that showed that southern parts of Nevada were ahead and parts of western Nevada. Yeah, I think if we go here, so any of you who are in this area where you're ahead, you're probably seeing lines that are where you're ahead on the threshold graph. All right. So a couple years ago, we were talking to some people who deal with insect pests about their needs for phenology information, and realized that there was a kind of a need for information about when insects would be active and the best time to treat them based on their thresholds for when they would emerge. And there weren't really readily available maps for a lot of species where people could easily see information about the best time to treat different insect pests at their locations. So we used information about the different thresholds for when different life cycle stages of insects would occur and turn them into a map that shows when people can expect to see those different life cycle stages at locations across the range of that species. So this map here is showing a map for emerald ash borer. And this species will have adult emergence when it gets to 450 growing degree days, which is represented by yellow. So if you look at the map, this was as of, this is the forecast for January 25th. I grabbed this map yesterday, and because it's a 6-day forecast, it's showing me what we expect to see 6 days from now. So if you are in southern Florida, you will potentially start seeing emerald ash borer if it exists down there. That's when it's warm enough or enough heat has accumulated for adults to emerge. If you're up in other parts of the Southeast, you're still in the waiting period where there has not been enough heat yet. And then if you're in those green band areas, you are in places where you might expect to see adults in the next couple weeks. This green area here, these people are going to see emerald ash borer within a week of January 25th. So there are a number of different applications for these maps. We created them for 12 different species of insect pests. So for forestry, there are different applications such as when to monitor for hemlock woolly adelgid, when to treat insects with pesticides such as emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, winter moth, gypsy moth. We also have a map for bufflegrass. It's the one invasive species that we have a forecast for, or plant species. And then when the risk of defoliation for moths is higher. For agriculture, we have a forecast for pine needle scale, and then also one for apple maggot. And then other landscape pests, we have forecasts for lilac borer, bagworm, and magnolia scale. So the top map here shows our forecast for hemlock woolly adelgid. So for the range of that species, you can see the places where they're getting, as of January 14th last year, the places in green are ones where they should be looking for eggs of that species. And the yellow areas, which are, I don't think there are any on this map yet at that point in the year, is where you look for eggs as well as active nymphs. The lower map here is our map for bufflegrass. So this is based on accumulated precipitation. I mentioned that study back from 2016 that found that a certain amount of rainfall needed to accumulate before 50% green up, which is when those plants are treated with herbicide. And this map shows the locations that have reached that amount of precipitation where we expect green up to occur within 2 weeks at those locations. And this was as of July 2019. So the way that we developed these forecasts was using the accumulated growing degree thresholds that are known for these different species. So these are thresholds that are published mostly in the cooperative extension literature. So people did lab experiments to figure out how much heat needs to accumulate before we're able to see the treatable life cycle stage of these insects. And so you can see the different thresholds that we identified in the literature for these different species. And then we were able to operationalize those thresholds and create maps that provide a prediction. So if you want to share in the chat, I don't know if any of you deal with any of these species in your work. I know a lot of these are Eastern species, but we do have some that are located in the West. But if you want to share whether these kind of forecasts would be useful to you if you deal with any of these particular species that we already have the forecast for. And maybe not.
Erin, I wonder if it's worth describing that we're not constrained just to insects necessarily. We mostly have forecasts for insects because that's where growing degree day thresholds have been established. But this approach of trying to predict the timing of an event in a particular species really can be applied to any seasonal event in a plant or animal. What's limiting us usually is whether there's a good model that exists that predicts that event.
Yeah, thanks. I think I have a Menti poll coming up where we'll ask for other species. So if you have other species, I think there are a couple that people have put in the chat. We would love to hear about other things that you would like to see as a forecast. And yeah, as Teresa said, we are constrained by whether there's a model available for that, but we're able to work with you or work with researchers to try to develop a model as well. So another component of our pheno forecast that we developed was a notification system to try to make it as easy as possible for people that are managing these species to know when to treat them. So for any of those 13 species that we have, the 12 insect pests and then bufflegrass, people can sign up to receive an email notification, and that's using that the 6-day forecast that we have available, as well as a lead up. We've kind of backed the forecast out to give 2 weeks notice to people as well. So when you sign up for a notification, for this example is lilac borer, you get an email 2 weeks before we predict that life cycle will occur, which is adult emergence for this species. And then again, 6 days before that will occur at your location. And these are based on zip code. So you plug in your zip code and let us know which of the species you want to get the notification for, and then you get them in your email. We also, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about kind of our method of working with stakeholders, often we'll try to do validation as well. So we have a what we call a Nature's Notebook campaign called Pest Patrol. And this encourages people to let us know when they see these different species. So these people will receive the notification, and then they can go out and look for that species and then report in through our Nature's Notebook, either the mobile app or our data sheets, whether they see these species at their location and what the life cycle stage is that they see. And so we have a couple years of data at this point where we can start to see how the forecast performs at different locations. Often these published thresholds that are in the cooperative extension literature are for a pretty limited location. You know, they might have been developed for one state. And so because we're predicting the forecast over the whole range of the species, we're not sure if it's going to perform exactly right at states that are really far away from where the original threshold was developed. So this kind of information will help us to see how the forecast performs, and then we can make adjustments potentially in the future. I don't know if Teresa, if you want to say anything more about the validation from the last couple years.
Oh, it's helpful to have those observations, absolutely, from on the ground for understanding when things are happening, to be able to determine whether our forecasts are performing well, because we only really want to make maps if they're actually accurate. But yeah, we have been limited so far with just a small amount of observational data to be able to validate the maps. So yeah, I don't have the statistics right at my fingertips. Certain species maps are performing better than others. It's kind of all over the map, really.
Yeah, cool, thank you. Okay, so this was the kind of the question we were getting at earlier. So we have, you know, these forecasts available for these 13 species, but we're interested in what other kinds of forecasts would be useful to you. So you can go back to the Menti, or if you want to post in the chat, that's also fine, and let us know what are the species that would be most useful for you. And we'll switch over to that. And I think some people have already posted a couple of things in the chat. Cheatgrass. Looks like someone already gets, a couple of people get the bufflegrass forecast. Emerald ash borer is one that people said was useful. Russian knapweed, okay. Spotted knapweed. Yeah, and we mentioned we are limited by whether there's information that would tell us, you know, how do we predict when the life cycle event of interest would occur, whether there's a model available or data available for these species. But if you also want to share anything about the management of that species, the species that we have available as pheno forecasts, the phenology is critical for the treatment of that species. So for example, with emerald ash borer, knowing about the timing of adult emergence allows people to know when to get out and spray, because that's when you would spray the pesticide on the tree, is when, or right before the adults are emerging. So that's another kind of a limitation of the forecast. Okay, Russian thistle coming up again. Yeah, and red brome, another one. Yeah, so if anyone wants to speak to whether the management of these species is related to their phenology, that would be helpful too. I know for some species, you just have to kind of get out and treat it whenever you can. Others, it's more linked to a particular time of the life cycle. You know, it might be like you have to spray a pre-emergent, or you really want to treat the species before the seeds are spreading. So any information about that too would be helpful. Okay, someone posted temperature indicator trends associated with invasive plant species. So I don't know if you can say more about that, Jay. Do you mean that a certain temperature triggers something happening with the invasive plant? And if anyone wants, I think you can also unmute if you want to say anything, or you can keep posting in the chat.
Yeah, this is Jay here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was just trying to get at, for one species that's talked about a lot here, cheatgrass, and I'm no expert on it, but the experience I've had from people, they said the best time to treat that oftentimes is in the winter when it first starts greening up. But for other species, you have so many days of a certain temperature, it'll start to emerge, and oftentimes that might be a time to treat it. And again, I'm not a invasive species specialist, but I think knowing when you have certain temperature over a certain number of days is just one example, and when would be optimal to go out and treat that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. A couple other things in the chat. Mormon crickets, treatment at early instar forms, migratory songbird and bat migrations. Oh, okay, cool. Tamarisk leaf beetle. Yeah, that's one that we've heard about before too. Okay, native plant phenology winter fact. Okay, what is it that you would want to forecast for that? Or what's the interest in that species? Okay, you can keep chatting stuff in or answering the Menti poll. I wanted to show just a couple of things on our website, just so you have kind of an orientation to that. So I mentioned that our visualization tool, it has these different seasonal stories that you can use. So this is a way to kind of quickly get into looking at the spring index information. And we also have the status of spring page that Teresa shared, and that's kind of our hub for sharing all the maps about what is the status of spring right now, which locations have reached the requirements. But this is a way for you to kind of interact with that forecast a little bit more. So you can actually zoom into the map and click on particular locations. So that's kind of the benefit of looking at it here in the Viz tool. So you can click and see for each of these pixels, what was the actual value, how many days early was the spring leaf index met. And you can also, in the Viz tool, look at the pheno forecast as well. So if you go into select the layer category, here's where you can find both the accumulated growing degree day maps. So if you wanted to switch over to that, you can look at those, and the same thing, you can click on the map to actually explore that. This is showing the current day map. You can also switch over and look at the anomaly map. So you can click and find your location to see how much ahead or behind that long-term average your location is. You can also get to our pheno forecasts here. So that would be looking at those different species forecasts and where those are at for different locations. Okay, it looks like there are a couple more things that were posted in the chat, so just make sure I cover everything. When seed collection would be available for many native plants? Yeah, that's a great application. How to tie in with soil moisture indices. Yeah, we haven't really done much with soil moisture. We've thought about it a bit in relation to things like fire risk. But I don't think we have soil moisture as one of the variables that we have for comparison, like in the Phenology observation portal and the Viz tool. But it would be interesting to be able to have that in the future. Would not mind the mayfly hatch phenology on South Fork Snake River. Okay. Yeah, we do have a mayfly campaign, and that is for the upper Mississippi River primarily. And it's focused on the burrowing mayflies up there. For any of the native shrubs and grasses, we use phenology to time exclusion of livestock of resting native vegetation. Okay, so it's useful for any of the native range shrubs. The lead time would need to be long enough to be practical for planning grazing. Right, okay. What is that time scale? Do you want to say anything more about that? Weeks or months? Native perennial grasses, seed out in beginning and end of growing season. Would like to know phenology of grizzly bear emergence from dens. It would be helpful to know optimal timing for seeding species. We generally plan grazing February, March. Okay, so yeah, it would probably be monthly. Differences in phenology from commercial and locally gathered reclamation seeds. Oh, that would be interesting. Yeah, months ahead. Okay. So let me just refresh this page here too. So I also mentioned you can explore all of the observed phenology data in our tool. So the easiest way to get to that is to go to the data explorer here. And you can pick which type of visualization you'd like. And if you need an orientation to what these are, you can start with those seasonal stories. So this is a way to get to know what like a phenology calendar, a scatter plot, an activity curve is. But you can also just jump into looking at different things here. And you'll have to, you can put in a boundary to look at only a certain location in the country if you like, or you can look at the whole country and just put in your year of interest and then different species and phenophases. So I encourage you to play around with that. If there are species that you're interested in that we have data for, you can see what's available there. And then if you want to export the data, this is a quick link to do that. So that'll take you into our Phenology observation portal. And then everything that you filtered for in the Viz tool will be populated as filters in that other tool. And then you can download an Excel file and actually see the data there. And then the last thing I wanted to show was just on the website here. So this is just our homepage for USA-NPN.org. You can quickly get to our status of spring page right from the homepage. So if you want to keep track of the arrival of the spring leaf and bloom indices, you can do that here. This also will eventually have that how typical is a spring map on this page as well. And then this is also from the homepage, kind of a quick link to those pheno forecasts. So if there's a forecast that you're interested in, you can get to it here. Here's the sign up form right on the right hand side here. If you'd like to sign up for one of the forecasts, you just give us your email and your zip code and check off which of the forecasts you want to get and then sign up. All right, so let me hop back over to my PowerPoint. So just to kind of recap what we talked about here, we have a number of tools where you can visualize and download the data, as I just mentioned, the start of spring maps and the pheno forecasts. We're definitely interested in continuing conversations with BLM about other information that would be useful. We got a ton of feedback from you all today. I really appreciate it on all the different species that you're interested in. I think we have the transcript and we should have everyone's contact info, I think, so we can reach out to you about particular things that you mentioned. And then please also feel free to get in touch with me if you have anything you'd like to talk further about. If there was a forecast that you thought of that would be really useful, if there is a type of phenology data that you're interested in that we might not have yet in the database, then please let us know. We're definitely interested in talking further with you about that. So any last questions, feel free to chat those in. Or if there's anything that you want to hear more about that we went over. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. I know that we were planning on having a break from 11:50 to 12. So we can still have a 10-minute break now if no one has other questions or comments, and then meet back a little bit earlier for the Nature's Notebook portion. So just to give you a heads up on what we're going to be talking about, we have a number of different ways for you to participate in Nature's Notebook. We have ways for you to collect data as a group, at your BLM unit. So I'm going to be describing all the different resources that we have for that and providing some examples of ways that different agency folks have used Nature's Notebook to meet different management and outreach objectives. And we'll have a BLM staff person, Rachel Sowers, is going to be joining us as well to talk about her experience using Nature's Notebook at the King Range. So if you want to stay on for that, that would be great. But let me just check the questions one more time just to make sure there's nothing that I missed. Lots of great feedback in here. Okay, I don't think there are any questions, Teresa or Lori. Did I miss any questions? Or is there anything you want to say?
Not that I've seen, no.
Yeah, I thought I seen either.
But I want to just second what Erin said about thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your all of this really helpful information.
All right, so we will plan to meet back in 10 minutes, so at 11:40 for the Nature's Notebook intensive step.
All right, Laura, I'm going to step out for 5 minutes.
Sounds good, Mike.
Hey everybody. So we are going to get started with the Nature's Notebook portion of the workshop. And I think a couple people just joined us. So my name is Erin Postumus. I'm the outreach coordinator and the liaison to the Fish and Wildlife Service for the USA National Phenology Network. And we've just gone over kind of an overview of all the different data and data products that we have available at the USA National Phenology Network, including some of the forecast maps we have for forecasting spring and our forecasts of insect, pests, and invasive species. And now we're going to switch over to talking more in depth about our data collection program, Nature's Notebook. Video. All right. So we established Nature's Notebook primarily because there was not a standardized way to collect phenology data across the country. So Nature's Notebook is a way to collect information about both plant and animal life cycle events. And there's kind of different ways that we collect information for plants and animals. We're collecting life cycle events, or what we call phenophases. And for animals, we're recording these at the species level. So we're interested in activity of animals. You know, if you see an animal species, what is it doing? Is it collecting nesting material if it's a bird? If you see a nest, are there nestlings in the nest? Are there fledged young? Different aspects of its development. For plants, we're actually asking people to mark individual plants and monitor those plants over time. That allows us to really see how the environment impacts the phenology of these species. So by knowing that it's the same individual plant over time, you can see whether, for example, it starts leafing at a different time in a particular year, maybe due to the temperature or the precipitation during that year. So for plants, we're asking questions about the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits. So there are different ways to collect phenology information. So you could think about, you could just record the first time that you see something. So it might be the first time that you see a migrant bird species, the first time that you see a flower. But someone who's looking at the data only then sees that one date that you recorded. We actually use status monitoring, which allows you to see all of the different dates that someone went out to look for that life cycle event, and then whether or not they saw it. So our observers are reporting a yes or a no for each of the life cycle stages or the phenophases. So we can really pinpoint the start and the end of that life cycle. So for example, there might be a species that has multiple flowering periods within a year. By recording the status of the phenology, we can record those different periods. So we know that there might have been one period that started and ended, and then there was a pause, and then another second period of flowering at a different time during the year. And we also have an additional measure of abundance that we ask our observers to record as well. So not just the presence or absence of the life cycle event, but the degree to which that was occurring. So for something like a tree, we might ask how many flowers are on the tree. And we have people put those in bins of numbers, or how many, or what percent of flowers on the tree are open. Or for animals, we might ask how many birds do you hear singing, or how many nestlings are in the nest. And that allows us to look at the peaks in timing as well. So we can see not only whether that phenophase was occurring, but when was it at its peak. So we have standardized protocols for over 1,000 plants and 371 animal species currently. I think we're adding a few more this month. We do add species about once a year, and we don't add too many. It's kind of based on whether particular partners are very interested in monitoring species that we don't have. So we do take requests from certain partners to add those species. But as of right now, we have quite a few already to observe. And so for each of the species that we have on our list, we have a protocol. This is a series of questions. And so it'll ask you, do you see, and then a number of different life cycle events. So for this is a Palo Verde, it's asking, do you see young leaves, covered leaves, etc. Also asking questions about flowering and fruiting. And so the observer will record either a yes or a no. We also added a question mark. We found that early on, people didn't like to just leave things blank, and we didn't want people to try to guess if they weren't absolutely sure about what they were seeing. So we added the question mark so that if they're not sure, they can indicate that question mark. And then if they need to go back, maybe they realize, oh, it really was occurring, they can go back and change their answer to a yes or no. There's also that little blank space you can see next to the question mark. That's where they would report the intensity or the abundance for that phenophase. And you can see on the right here, we have our definitions for each of these questions. We have the bins for the intensity here below each definition. So for young leaves, the observer would select from one of these bins that get progressively larger to make it easier to estimate those responses. And we really have a lot of detail in our definitions. We want to take all of the guesswork out of making observations. So we're very specific about what exactly we're talking about and how you know that a leaf is young versus a full leaf. And so all that is in detail here in that definition. For things like ripe fruits, we have an additional, what we call our species specific part of the definition. So that'll actually tell you for this species, you'll know that it's a ripe fruit because it looks like this, and it'll give a description of that. So it's even more detail on how to figure out whether or not that phenophase is occurring. To give you an idea of one of our animal data sheets, so this is one for sandhill crane. So we recently, a couple years ago, added even more questions onto our data sheets to really capture the full life cycle for these species. So we're asking about different behaviors. Do you see feeding? Do you see specific kind of feeding? Are you hearing calls? And then we also have questions about the reproduction and development all the way through to fledged young. And then as with the plants, this is a yes or a no that you can respond. And then the space there would be to record the raw abundance. So how many animals did you see in each of these phenophases? And I mentioned it's different between the plants and animals, whereas with plants, you have a tagged individual that you're going back to that same one. For animals, you're recording this at the species level. So you have kind of a checklist for each of the locations that you're observing at, and you are reporting for that species what you're seeing. And then we have the same types of definitions for each of these phenophases. So we're telling you exactly what we're looking for there. So we have a couple options for data entry. So you can use paper data sheets. Those are available. You can see here, you can download your data sheets here from what we call your observation deck for the place where you're logged in on the website. And then you enter the data on an online entry form on the website, which matches the data sheet. So you would record your responses here, translate them into yes, no, or question mark, and then this drop-down menu has those bins of intensity or abundance questions. You can also use our mobile app. So we have an app for Android and iPhone that works offline. So if you are in a location where you don't have service, all the data will be stored locally on your phone, and you can have it set to only upload them over Wi-Fi. So once you get back to your office or your home, then you can upload the data at that point. You can also select to have them upload over your service provider too, and not over Wi-Fi if you would like to use your data. We have a lot of different resources available to help you learn how to use the program. So we have an online course called our Observer Certification course, and that will walk you through how to set up your site and add your different plants and animals, kind of some guidelines for observing, how frequent we'd like you to observe. Really, we'll take any observations, there's not a strict requirement on that. we prefer that when things are really happening, you know, in the springtime or around the time when those life cycle stages are transitioning, if you can observe 2 to 3 times a week, that really helps to pinpoint the kind of the start and end of those different life cycle events. So that would be the ideal frequency if you can, you know, more is better. But we realize that it's hard for people to, especially people going out to remote locations, to observe that frequently. So really anything that you can do is helpful. We take all the data that we can. And so it has different guidelines like that in the course, and it'll walk you through pretty much everything you need to know about getting started. We are adding additional courses as well, or modules. So we have one in there that's about how to use the app that navigates you through that. We also have a practicing observations module that will talk you through, it'll give you pictures to look at and you can practice answering the questions. We also have the guidelines on how to observe in a PDF format, or how to observe handbook. So if you want to actually print something out and take it out into the field with you, we have that available. We have a couple other print resources as well. This is our botany primer. This is a really great resource, especially if you're doing this as an educational activity with a classroom. This is like a supplemental set of information that goes through all of the botany that you need to know for Nature's Notebook. So it might be more in-depth than your regular observer needs, but if you really want to get into all the different parts of the plant and everything that's kind of behind the questions that we're asking, then that's available for free on the website for download, or you can order it in a print version. And I think it's something like $12 or $13, I think, just to cover the printing costs if you want a hard copy of that. We always get asked about data quality because we do have citizen scientists or community scientists, volunteers who are collecting the data. And we have a number of different aspects that we have reported on this, information sheet here. Oh boy. So we go through our quality assurance measures, which are the measures we're taking, you know, before the data comes in, to try to make sure people are trained, they have all the information that they need. And then the quality control, which are measures that happen after we get the data. So sometimes we'll have flags in the database for certain things that look off. This is especially for situations where we have multiple observers looking at a particular species at a location or a particular plant, and they both say something different. It'll put a flag in the database that we'll just let data users know that there might be something wrong. And we have a lot of other measures that are planned for implementation in the future. So you can, if you want more detail about that, you can look up that URL. We'll have all the information about the different measures that we have available currently, and then the ones we're planning on implementing. We are also compliant with federal policy. So we went through the Paperwork Reduction Act, and all of our data sheets are compliant with that. Also the Privacy Act, Mobile Act Security, and then 508 compliance as well. We have a number of data collection campaigns, which are efforts that are centered around species that are of particular interest either to researchers or to natural resource managers. And these are, they're focused on particular species or groups of species. And it really provides a way for you to plug into an effort that's already ongoing, where you know that the data that you're collecting are going to be directly used by someone. All of the data that are collected in Nature's Notebook are potentially going to be used by someone in the future, but some people like to know that I want to know exactly what's going to happen to my data right now, so I can say that the data that I'm collecting at my site are going to be used this year for this purpose. So this is a great way to plug right into one of those efforts. So you can see on the map which of the campaigns are available for different locations across the country. So for folks in the West in particular, I would suggest our Nectar Connectors campaign. So that is an effort that we started with the Fish and Wildlife Service a number of years ago. They were concerned, this is at the point where they were doing the species status assessment for monarchs. They wanted to know more about when the nectar sources are available for monarchs, whether there's potentially mismatch happening. And so we worked out a list of species in all different regions. So we have 53 species total across the country that are nectar plants that are important for monarchs and other pollinators that we have on that list. And so there's something for everyone in every state to record. And we're interested in the flowering timing for those species. We also have our Green Wave campaign available for the West. So that is a campaign that we started to record information about the leaf out of these dominant overstory deciduous trees. There's this progression of green up that occurs across the country each spring. You can actually see it on the satellite where you can see leaf out happening in the south and it spreads up to the northern latitudes. And so we were documenting when that leaf out was occurring in these different dominant trees in different regions across the country. And that in more recent years, we've kind of switched over to asking people to focus on flowering because we're interested in potentially allergenic species and knowing when the flowers are open and potentially releasing pollen can help us to make allergy forecasts in the future. So we've asked our Green Wave observers to focus on the flowering and then also the fall leaf color as well. We're hoping to, at some point, have a fall leaf map that will be similar to the status of spring map that will inform when leaves will change color in the fall. And then we have Pest Patrol, which I mentioned earlier. This is the validation effort for our pheno forecast species. And so it's all of those different insect pests. And so if you have any of those in your state, you can also take part in that campaign. The Clone Lilac campaign is another one that's in some of our Western states. So that one is that effort that was started back in the 1950s. That is the data that went into our status of spring maps that informed the leaf out and bloom. So we still have people participating in that campaign now. You can also observe common lilacs if you don't have the clone lilac. And so that's another one you can take part in that part of the country. And then for those of you that are in the Southwest, we have our Flowers for Bats campaign. So that was another effort that was started by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're interested in knowing about when nectar sources are available for the lesser long-nosed bats when they're in southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico during the summertime. And so that is documenting columnar cacti and agave flowering in those parts of those states. So here's an example of what it means to be part of one of the campaigns. So when someone signs up for a campaign, basically they're adding themselves onto an email list and then they get information about that campaign. They're encouraged to make observations and we'll send out these messages about once a month. So the messages include some tips on how to observe the species that are part of the campaign. So we'll send out prompts to say, you might expect to see leafing right now or flowering or fruiting. And then this is what you might want to look for. And sometimes we have pictures to help people identify that phenophase. And then we have lots of results as well. So we'll tell people what they and their fellow observers are reporting for that campaign and do data summaries. These are summaries that are created using our visualization tool. For the ones on the middle there, that's one of the activity curves that shows the overlap in when the different open flowers were occurring for 2 different species. And then we have some different things for motivation to kind of comparing how many records different units have collected. So there are a couple national wildlife refuges and national parks on here. And it just shows kind of who's leading the way in number of observations reported. And then some other incentives we have for our observers. We have a leaderboards on our website, and that has kind of the monthly or the annual or different top observers that have been reporting. So just a little bit of healthy competition to inspire people to collect data. We also have badges, which are virtual little images that people earn for doing observations on different species. So we have one for each of the campaigns. So when people observe a certain number of weeks for that campaign, then they get a badge. We also have badges for their first observation, the 1000th observation. If someone reports all the different parts of a life cycle, starting from the buds all the way through to open flowers, and then badges that focus on negative data as well, because we really emphasize that the no records are just as important as the yes records. So we really want to encourage people to go out and report those as well. And then I mentioned earlier our visualization tool. This is a great tool for our observers as well. There's actually on the login page for people when they, we call it their observation deck, when they are managing their different species and sites and everything. And if they're using paper data sheets, that's where they're also entering data. We have this Phenology calendar for them to use. And so this actually allows people to look at a few different species that they're observing. And it's a really great way for them to look at what happened last year, to kind of anticipate when they should go out and start observing this year for those same species and phenophases. And it's also a data quality tool. So it'll allow them to see if they reported something that might have been out of order, or a little bit strange. Maybe they said a yes somewhere in the winter here when they shouldn't have. It's just a great visual for them to see that, and then they can go in and correct their observations. And then, of course, they can use the main visualization tool that we have to visualize just their own data if they'd like, or they can look at all of the data available. So maybe they're reporting a maple in their yard, they can go in and look at all of the people in their state that are also observing that same maple and see, how their data kind of line up. Or they can look at, region or national level as well. So one of the benefits of submitting data to Nature's Notebook is the data are used in many different research studies and by natural resource managers for policymaking. So we have a number of examples here of different peer-reviewed publications that have used our Nature's Notebook data. I think we have over 90 peer-reviewed publications to date that have used the data. And then we've also had some of our, like our spring index used in some of these government reports, like the EPA Climate Change Indicators report. So it's nice to be able to tell people that their data aren't just being submitted online and then going away into the ether. The data are constantly used by researchers, and we have a number of places you can point people to on the website to see examples of how the data have been used. So here are a few more, just kind of summarizing some of the results from the last couple years. So I mentioned that the study where we put the status of spring information in the context of parks and wildlife refuges. So some of the results from that, we found that spring is advancing in, 3/4 of the national parks and national wildlife refuges. And then 50% are experiencing extremely early springs compared to historical conditions. Phenology observations help manage invasive species. We've seen that in the verbicina example, bufflegrass, ragweed. Invasive shrubs leaf out earlier and hold on to leaves longer than native shrubs. This was actually a Nature's Notebook campaign that we ran for 3 years, a few years back. And so the researcher who inspired that campaign has published her results from that campaign as of last year. We've also had people use our milkweed data to find that milkweed are flowering earlier in response to temperature changes. And so these are all located on our website. The URL is right here, but those are all examples of ways that the data have been used in peer-reviewed publications. So we have a kind of a different way for people to observe as part of a group. So there's, we have our backyard observers. Those are people who can observe at their home or another location nearby. Anyone can participate, and it's pretty simple. You just set up a site. It could be your yard or some other location that you frequent, and then you set up different plants and animals that you want to observe. But we recognized early on that we have these different organizations, groups of people, including people from DOI agencies, that want to observe as part of their organization. And so we have what we call our local phenology programs, where you can come together with a group of people and have a shared observation location or set of locations that makes it easier for you to have multiple people participating. So I always recommend before you start out with your own local phenology program to have a couple questions that you kind of ask your team. First off, do you have a need for phenology data? Some people come at this from the outreach or education side, which is fine. And so they're more thinking about how can I engage people, maybe visitors that are coming to the land that I manage, or I want to engage with a local school. But I think it's good to think about that and be really clear on that from the start, whether it's your primary purpose is that you want to collect phenology data, or if your primary purpose is you want to engage the public or visitors or whoever it is in doing science. And then think about, for both of those cases, what are the species that are of greatest concern at your site? What's the information that would be really useful to you to record? So what it takes to create a local phenology program is a couple years at first. It often takes people a few years to get up and running. There's often, a trial period where you're starting to use the program. Maybe you'll set up a couple of monitoring sites with a number of species, and then you realize that you don't really like the design that you've created, and so you want to change it. And so just know that it'll probably take a couple years to get it into the place where you want to keep it going and you're collecting really useful information. You definitely also want to have a leader who will support your volunteers. I think often people think, oh, I can use citizen scientists to collect data for me. And that's really great. It'll free up, I won't have to have staff time or use like interns to do it. And it's free work basically. But you really have to have someone who at least will communicate with the people that are observing a couple hours each month so that they feel like they're supported. And it's going to be, the time will be a little front loaded because you'll want to have some time to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the program, they get the training that they need. You can, of course, take advantage of all of the training resources we have on the website, but it's good to have someone who's there as a local point person so that you have a resource for your volunteers. So you can send them to that person and they can ask us questions from there, or ask us for advice on the training resources and things to provide. But it's always good to have a designated person. And that person can also be a volunteer. If you have a super active person who has been volunteering for a long time, it might be that they're ready to take on a leadership role, but it's good to just have a designated person. And then I always recommend also having someone who will report back to your volunteers. And that could be the same leader that you've already identified, but volunteers really like to hear about what's happening with the data that they collect. So you want to be able to close the loop on that and say, maybe at the end of the year or the end of the season, this is what you collected, this is what we learned, and here are the results and what's going to happen. And that'll really help with maintaining engagement of your volunteers and keep them going, because you have to spend quite a bit of time getting people trained up. And so you don't want to lose those folks. You want to keep them engaged if you can, and observing for multiple years. And you can take advantage, as I mentioned, of our campaign. So if you have volunteers, you don't have a lot of capacity to have someone spend time looking through the data, you can select one of our campaign species, and then you'll sign up for the notifications. You'll get the emails with all the results, and then you can use those to share back that information with your volunteers. And we've kind of done the work for you there. So these are some of the resources we have available for these local phenology programs. We have a community of practice where we're going to be starting up monthly calls this year. And we have a forum that people can use to ask questions of each other. We get a lot of people when they start a new program, they'll go on there and ask about guidance on maybe like how to tag plants, or what kind of signs have worked for people in the past, or things like that. And you'll get a lot of responses from experienced local phenology leaders there. We have a lot of program planning materials as well. So you might have done that for other aspects of your job, but we actually have materials to walk you through really thinking about long-term, what's your goal for this program? What are you hoping to get out of it? what's going to happen if you leave your position, maybe you move to another unit, who's going to take over on managing the volunteers, and to really document all of that. And that will be really helpful for making this a long-term plan or long-term program. And then all of this is in our Phenology program handbook. The screen cap of that's on the left, that's on the website as well. And that's just a PDF version of all of this information that you can go through to get started with your program. And then of course we have all of our data visualizations that can help you as well. We have special features for these local phenology programs where they can get a special link to our Viz tool that pre-populates the Viz tool with their data. It's filtered for their group. And that just makes it really easy for you to create data visualizations. And you can look at your phenology data there. We also have another a tool for you to use to kind of look at your observer activity. So you can do reports on like how many observers have you had in different months of the year, how many site visits have you made, what's your most observed species, and that kind of stuff. And all that is on the website right there. Okay, so before I jump into, I have some example ways. I just want to check into the questions to see, looks like we've had some things come in. Teresa, do you want to maybe let me know what I've missed, just because there's a lot in here that you haven't answered?
Sure. I've been answering things as we go. The most recent question that came in, though, that I haven't had a chance to answer is, do you have a geographical guide to LPPs? So if people I know are interested in another part of the country, they can look into Get Trained, Join, etc.
Yeah, so we are working on that. We recognize that is something that we definitely want to have. So we're actually in the process of doing a website relaunch, and that will eventually have a map that has locations of local phenology programs. I would say the best thing to do right now is we have a list of active phenology programs on our website. I don't know if Teresa, maybe you can grab that link on it's under the For Groups menu. Yes, and there you can search for state. And that's probably the easiest way right now to just find out coarsely at the state level who is monitoring phenology there with a local phenology program. But yeah, we do recognize that's a big need, because we even have observers who say like, well, I don't want to start my own group, but I do want to be able to like find out if I can join a group that already exists. Or we have people who want to find out if there's a group they can collaborate with, and kind of leverage each other's resources. Oh yeah, thanks.
Did you want me to keep feeding you the questions, Erin?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll show this link on here too. So we can see if we can find who is in Oregon. So these are the groups right now. Oh, that's not right. I don't know why that one's coming up on Oregon, but these should be right. Not actually, I have to check on that. There are a couple here that are correct. North Salem High School Oregon Season Tracker is actually a statewide effort. If you click on these, you'll get a little bit more of a description about what they're doing. This one is a great effort. They're working with the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest there. And they have a lot of observers recording all across the state. So yeah, other questions?
Erin, there was a question of whether we identify kind of holes in the country where we don't have good data coverage, and whether we try to recruit folks to address those needs.
Yeah, I don't know that we've made a huge effort to do that. I mean, we do for the campaigns, because we monitor those results the most closely. We do kind of take a note of where we need more observers. And if we have the opportunity to reach out to groups that we know about in those areas, we will. But that's definitely, I think, an area where we could improve, is to really try to go after those gaps. I think a lot of it's a capacity issue. We'd love to be able to try to do more kind of outreach efforts like that, but we're just trying to keep everyone going, that's already observing, and then we kind of let people come to us if they have a need for phenology data. But we always have, we promote through like SciStarter, which is a big database of citizen science programs. So we have information on there that people can find us through. And then we post on various listservs and things like that. But yeah, I think we could probably do more in the area of geographical gaps for sure.
Erin, there was also the question about what age group we say these things, the program is appropriate for.
Yeah, so I think you can make any age group work in different ways. We do require that to have your own Nature's Notebook account, you have to be 13 years or older, and that's because of the Child Protection Act. But if you have younger groups of students, as long as you have teachers or adult supervisors, you can still do this program with them. You just have to have a lot more help. So you'd have to probably have like smaller groups of students. You would have an adult representative with each group, and then that person would be recording the data most likely. Maybe you would look at the plant with the students and then figure out what the answer was together, and then you'd have the adult recording the data and then entering the data. But we have had that work for people in the past. But generally we say elementary school and older. And then for people that are, if you want kids to do it on their own, it would be middle school or high school and up.
There was also a question about whether we bring in data from other programs, things like the Christmas bird count or backyard bird feeder counts, or BioBlitzes.
Yeah, so we don't bring in data into our database. I mean, it would be possible to, if you wanted to combine data sources, we've had people do that in the past on publications and just kind of like casually look at combinations of data. I think we had someone in our office a number of years ago look at our Nature's Notebook deciduous tree data in comparison to eBird. So it's definitely possible, but we don't bring in the data directly.
And then finally, there was some enthusiasm for whether we enabled folks to submit photos to enable species verification or perhaps phenophase verification along the lines of what iNaturalist offers.
Yeah, we would love to be able to do that, but it's so computationally expensive given the number of observations we have and species that that's not really our focus. So we have the ability for people to upload a single photo for each plant to kind of help them relocate their individual plant, to just give them cues about which one they're looking for, because they are going back to the same individual. But for the day-to-day observations, it's just the questions that they're answering, not a photo.
Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go back over my PowerPoint. So I wanted to go through some examples of different ways that groups are using Nature's Notebook, just to kind of inspire you all the different ways that you can use Nature's Notebook for management or outreach, or maybe a combination of the two. So I think, yeah, the first one we have is, I'm hoping Rachel is on here. So Rachel Sowers generously offered to describe her effort for us. I think she's much more able to talk about the details of what they did. So maybe I'll pass it over to her to describe their program.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for letting me join. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. So for several years, I worked in the King Range National Conservation Area as the interp specialist, education specialist. I've now taken on a new role as the BLM National Education Program Lead. But I'm excited to talk about this, our phenology monitoring in the King Range, because I thought it was a great way to engage the community. So the reason that we kicked it off and started doing it is because our botanist was noticing some changes with the plants, and she wanted to start to track what was going on. And so she's the one who came to the education team and said, hey, can we partner together to engage the community in this? And we went after some BLM funding in order to support this project. And so the first thing we did was we went out and identified the sites that would be best for the public to go to as far as accessibility and ease of visiting, frequency, and if we could, also put some interpretive panels up there as well. And so we identified plants that were part of Nature's Notebook that worked well for what we wanted to do. And there was actually 5 different locations throughout the entire field office. The King Range National Conservation Area is actually about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of the main field office. And there was a separate office down there. So we had our own individual sites separate from the other ones north of us. And I think one of the things that we quickly learned in identifying our plants was to make sure that we looped in other staff members, what plants we were looking to monitor, because a couple of them got cut down. So that's an important piece of this program, is to make sure that maintenance or people doing trail work or, volunteers, that people know that you have plans to monitor that plant and not allow it to get cut down. So we decided to go with a 3-pronged approach, and those were to engage community members in their local yard, to engage visitors with the interpretive panels, and then to engage the students at the local high school. And so the first one, what we did with the community members, is we offered a phenology monitoring training as part of our lecture series that we have every year. And what was great is there is already a lot of really engaged volunteers, people that were master gardeners. One lady had already been tracking when, plants would bud and blossom for, I think she had like a data set of like 30 years. And so those were some of the people that were interested in this, as well as others that just, had never heard of this before and wanted to be engaged. And some of them set up their own backyard site, and then others wanted to help out with some of the sites we had throughout the King Range. We decided on, with the interpretive panels, we used in that photo in the bottom right, there's a gal looking at an interpretive panel. We had the same look and feel of those throughout the entire field office. So if someone wanted to do some monitoring in the King Range or Headwaters or up in Trinidad, it would all be the same. And it showed the different phenophases. And then there was a spot for a notebook. And what we did is we took the monitoring sheets that Erin pointed out earlier, and we just reduced those in size and we glued them into a notebook. And it actually worked pretty well. And then they were in a rain protected container, and people were able to, as they walked by on a nature trail or at an overlook, be able to notice, whatever changes they saw. The thing with that, which Erin noted earlier, is you really have to have a point person on staff or a volunteer who is going to make sure that they go regularly to collect those notebooks and enter the data into the website. Otherwise, it just kind of sits there. And then the third one was with the schools. I already had a really strong partnership with the local high school because I was doing phytoplankton monitoring with the marine biology class. And when I approached the science teacher and told her I wanted to look at doing this, we looked at school state standards and figured out which science class it would fit best with, and started coming up with a plan to train the students. The botany primer was excellent in really kicking off just kind of what botany is and different, parts of the plants and phenophases. And so we had several class sessions where I went to the classroom, we watched maybe 5-minute clip video, kicked things off, and we, just talked about what's happening and climate change and why we cared and why the Bureau of Land Management was being involved. And then we actually started working through the data sheets and how they worked. And then the site we selected for the high school students was right across the street and worked great, and being able to have that convenience of going over as often as we could. And I would say there was definitely an ebb and flow of how we did that. And that was because of just how it worked out with the school. And so like the fall and spring, we were able to get over there weekly or every other week. And then of course the summer was our big kind of weak point. I would try and engage the students, the interns that we had sometimes in doing that. Or one year we had someone say they lived locally there and that they would go over and do it. And so, you know, trying to fill those holes in data collection when possible. And when we first started doing it, I just printed out the monitoring sheets on clipboards and we'd go over and do it that way. And then I was able to get a grant and get some tablets that the students were able to use. And then some just put it on their phone. Now, the thing was, I didn't want to have to have every student have an account. So we created like one master account that everyone contributed to, which did have some glitches. So it depends on the size of the participants and how you would do that and how data is being entered, but it's definitely something to consider, whether or not people should have their own individual accounts or a group account that everyone's contributing to. I would recommend, it was really helpful that we would take people, you know, if they had a tablet or a cell phone, they also had a clipboard. And so then they would enter all the data on the clipboard on the piece of paper, and then I could double check it. So whether, you know, their assigned plants got entered properly or not, I could always go back and I had the hard copy to make sure it was done accurately. And this was a great way to engage the community and as well as the students. And they loved it. They looked forward to being able to do this and seeing the changes that they had never noticed in these plants, even though they had, you know, lived there their entire lives. Right now, there's a bunch of staff changes and the students are all virtual. So the program's kind of suspended at the time, but hopefully next fall, we'll be able to get back out there and re-engage those students. So I don't know if there's questions that I could answer, or if there's anything else you wanted me to cover, Erin.
So that was perfect. It's a great description, and it's really impressive what you guys did there. Thank you for describing it. But yeah, if anyone has questions for Rachel, definitely put them in the chat. Okay, well, you can keep posting questions. I'm going to move on to the next one. So I have a couple National Wildlife Refuge examples that I wanted to share because I think it's interesting the different ways that they're using Nature's Notebook for different purposes. So Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge is an urban refuge just outside the Twin Cities. And they are interested in generally documenting changes in phenology of species that they care about on the refuge. They're focused primarily on deciduous trees and then nectar plants for monarchs and other pollinators. I think especially in the last few years, there's been a big push in the Fish and Wildlife Service to plant plants for monarchs, milkweeds and other species that they can use. And so that's one of their main interests in phenology there. They have a number of volunteers that are already they were involved in the refuge. And so they were able to tap into that source for observers. And so they have a number of volunteers that they have trained in doing phenology observations. And so they kind of have different trails on the refuge that they're assigned to. And they make observations pretty regularly, I think about once a week. And the good thing about having multiple volunteers is you can actually have them trade off as well. So you could have, a schedule where people are going out every other week or maybe even once a month. So it's less of a observation effort burden on any one person. and that can help to keep people engaged and kind of sustain your program over the long term as well. They do have a refuge staff person who is an urban biologist who's in charge of the program. And so she's able to provide direct support to the volunteers. So she checks in with them about once a month just to make sure that everything's going okay. They even have every couple of months, they'll have like a meeting all together where they do kind of go over what's been going on with the different plants that they're observing and make sure that everyone's on the same page. And sometimes we call those like a calibration training. So it would be after the initial trainings, once your observers are out in the field, just to make sure that everyone knows, you know, what is a breaking leaf bud versus a young leaf versus a full leaf, to make sure that everyone's collecting the data the same way. And then the graph that's on here shows some of their data from 2019, comparing their observations of monarchs with observations that actually were from the area surrounding the refuge. So you can see there's not much of a difference, but the monarch observations at the refuge dropped off a little bit sooner than in the areas within 50 miles. So our refuges have this capacity to do this comparison of observations on the refuge to the landscape that surrounds the refuge. Another example is Don Edwards, San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So they were one of our earliest refuges to adopt the Nature's Notebook program. And they are primarily using it as an outreach tool for visitors. So they've stated that having Nature's Notebook provides kind of a depoliticized way to talk about climate change. So sometimes they have people who don't really want to hear about climate change and they feel a little bit threatened by hearing about it. So by having these people involved in just looking at plants, and then it provides them a way to say, well, this is what we're seeing this year, and we can look back at our data from previous years and you can actually see the changes that have happened over time. And then they can start to talk about, well, why would it be that the plants are shifting in their timing? And then they can bring in information about climate, like drought that's happening in California, or other aspects as well. And they're actually part of a larger effort that was started back in 2010 called the California Phenology Project. So this was an effort with a number of different national parks and universities and the Wildlife Refuge. And so they selected their plants based on the species list from that larger effort, because they felt like the data would be more used if they were collaborating with other people collecting data on the same species. And so they have staff and interns that actually collect the data. And then when they have visitors that come in, they lead them on the phenology walks, and then they have the chance to talk about how things are changing there on the refuge. And then I think this is the last example is Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge. I mentioned this in the first part of the workshop, but this was a former dairy and alfalfa farm that is located just south of Albuquerque on the middle Rio Grande. And they're trying to transition this refuge from that alfalfa farm into seasonal wetlands and bosque forests with cottonwoods and other species. And as they're doing this process, they had to figure out the timing of different restoration activities. So they had volunteers very early on after the refuge was established that were going around the refuge to look at different sites and very systematically describe the phenology of the dominant tree species there, which are the Siberian elm, which is an invasive plant, and the Rio Grande cottonwood, which is the native that they want to promote the growth of. And then they were also recording observations of the different bird species that they were seeing there. And so they, over a number of years, were able to record information about when these Siberian elms had flowers and fruits. And they wanted to know that because they wanted to avoid the germination of those trees because they're trying to eradicate them. And so by knowing when the trees have their seeds, they could do any seasonal flooding, which kind of promotes germination, or tilling, which would help to kind of work the seeds into the soil at a time before those seed events happened. And then they also are using Phenology to monitor the success of cottonwood trees that they've planted, which they're trying to establish the bosque forest. So they have students that they work with that are recording the phenology of those young cottonwoods that were pole plantings on the refuge. And then they also, of course, are the ones that recorded that breeding bird information about the swallows on the milk barn, and they were able to avoid doing the demolition during the breeding season timing. So they have, these are volunteers that a lot of them came in through the Friends group for the refuge, and then they also were able to connect with master naturalists in the area and recruit people that way. And then their volunteers are supported by a trail coordinator. We have a larger Rio Grande Phenology trail where there's a number of different partners, including botanical gardens and a couple other state wildlife refuges in the area. And so they all have similar species that they're monitoring. And the trail coordinator is funded through a local program called the Bosque Ecosystem Monitoring Program, which is the educational program. And she's able to support those volunteers along the trail with different trainings and newsletters and things like that. We do have an upcoming opportunity that I wanted to mention. We have an online training for local phenology leaders in particular. This is a course that is a 10-week course. It takes about 60 to 80 hours total. It just requires a $50 to $5 fee for course materials. It'll probably start running next month. And we have an application on the website where you can, if you want to get on the interested list, so you are the first to hear about it. That will kind of set you up with learning everything you need to know about how to start a local phenology program. You can also do this on your own, with all the materials that I mentioned, or you can get in touch with me about going through some of the materials or talking through what a program might look like. But if you want to have like the most in-depth experience, this would be a great chance for you to get that. All right, so just to recap the resources that we have, if you'd like to learn about Nature's Notebook and just kind of try it out on your own, I welcome you to register an account. You can do the online trainings like the Observer Certification course that takes about an hour. You can try out our mobile app and look into our different data visualization tools to see what species we have available. And then we have all of those resources for the local phenology programs as well. And we're also here and happy to help you get started. So you can check out the stuff on our website or feel free to email me if you have questions. I'm happy to talk through with you what a program might look like to meet different objectives that you have. And yeah, I would love to hear from any of you. So are there any more questions that have come in? Or feel free to post any last questions in the chat, or you can get in touch over email too.
Yeah, nothing more really from here.
Okay. All right, well, thanks everyone for hanging in there for the almost 3 hours. It's a long workshop and we covered a lot of material, but I'm happy to send the slides around to you. I don't know if that's something that you usually do, Lori, but I can send you a PDF version if that's a little smaller of the slide deck. And then we have, all the links that we've posted in the chat are in there, and we could also make a list of links to send out in a follow-up email.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So thank you, Erin and Teresa, for sharing your website with us. And the surveys, I think, were particularly important in showing us how we can use the data, excuse me, use your data. So thank you for that. And here's your last chance. Any other last minute questions for Erin or Teresa?
Lori, will the recording be made public? I shared that we were doing this workshop over Twitter and there was actually some interest in the recording.
Yeah, we can make it available to the public.
That would be great. Thank you.
So somebody asks, can we do any plants we choose?
So you are limited to what's on the Nature's Notebook list. I mentioned we have a process for adding species. We try to limit it to only adding species that we know people are going to observe. And so if you have a group of people that have a long-term plan for observing that species, we're more likely to add it. But yeah, you can send me an email if you have something that's not on our list, and we can talk about it. Cool. Thanks all for such great engagement too. I really appreciate all the feedback. It's really useful for us, and we might be following up with some of you individually about some of the things that you told us. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating. We had a great group, and it's very impressive. So thank you for spending your mornings with us.
Yeah, thanks, Lori, and thanks, Michael.
All right, we'll see you guys later. We'll be in touch.
Thanks a lot.
Want to stop recording, Lori?
Yes, indeed.